So this is what you'll hear in the first hour. We'll have an introduction by Anita Bromberg, which will be an overview of online hate in Canada. Then Phil Gursky will speak about terrorism as hate crime. Tamas Barish will speak about the INACH project to research, report, and remove online speech. And finally, Dr. Andre Oboler will speak about measuring and monitoring online hate, methodology, and tools. You'll find all information about our speakers and about the webinar in our website, www.crrf-fcrr.ca. Please note that Dr. Abby Korb will not be able to attend and will therefore be replaced by Anita Bromberg, who is the Executive Director of the CRRF. Tamas Barish is located in Holland, and Dr. Andre Oboler is located in Australia. So special thanks to you both for accepting to work respectively after and before hours to participate to our webinar. Okay, so first speaker, Anita Bromberg, is presently the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Previously, she was the National Director of Legal Affairs for the Jewish advocacy group B'nai B'rith Canada and Human Rights Coordinator of their League of Human Rights, where she oversaw the legal initiatives of the organization's advocacy efforts and was responsible for the operation of the organization Anti-Hate Hotline and its annual report on racism. So Anita Bromberg.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all that are joining us. The idea for this topic actually came from a recent conference that we held here in Toronto, and we held a panel on online hate. What are the problems? What are the solutions? And this is an attempt at diving in a bit deeper into this conversation, which is, I think, every country, including Canada, continues to struggle with. I note a quote from an American case back in 1996 that dealt with the internet and its issues that it presented. One of the judges there said that the internet is now as diverse as human thoughts, and that makes us pause as we here in Canada struggle with how to access the benefits and the promises of diversity and inclusion. The Council of Europe, in a very recent report, notes that in the past it was necessary to negotiate one's way through institutionalized media in order to get one's message to the masses. But now we know the messages can and do spread like wildfire across the globe. All that's needed sometimes is for a message to go viral, which is sometimes a strategy, sometimes it's just a matter of luck or happenstance. This capacity has obvious benefits for democracy, of society, and public discourse, but of course, at the same time, we understand that it facilitates the growth of low level of hate-based digital speech. Clearly, the internet is increasingly being used for spreading hate speech in different ways and contexts, whether it's the dissemination of propaganda, other types of misinformation. We know conspiracy theories are awash, hate spam, exchange of information, whether it be social media or discussion groups or listservs. We understand that those that choose to spread hate are optimizing, using search engine optimizations, such as hyperlinking and so forth, for best advantages. Recently, we actually had a case here of usurping domain names and leading the innocent onto the websites of the hate promoters. Well, Canada is no exception to this growing phenomenon. Some people have chosen to say that it's all very recent coming, but we, I think, all understand that this has been a struggle for some time to try to get where that balance between freedom of speech and hate speech is something that we here in Canada have been struggling for some time ago. Years ago, I was part of a conference in the early 2000s examining online hate. And at that time, we talked about estimates of about 200 websites that had a connection to Canada that had a hate base. But I think that number now, while there's no great measure of it, and in fact it's difficult to measure with the global reach of the internet, has greatly expanded. Here in Canada, we started struggling with this idea of what is the right balance between freedom of speech and hate speech. Back in a case called John Ross Taylor, self-described fascist. He was jailed in Ontario in the 1980s, where he used the telephone technology to spread hate messages. And eventually that case made it up to the Supreme Court of Canada, which ruled, luckily, I suppose, against Taylor. The majority ruled under our human rights legislation that restrictions to freedom of expression were justified. The court actually said Parliament's objective of preventing the harm caused by hate propaganda is of sufficient importance to warrant overriding a constitutional freedom. But there was a minority opinion, and this shows you the struggle that we had at the time, and perhaps highlights what we're continuing to struggle with. And that is that minority opinion was written by Beverly McLaughlin, who is now our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. And Her Honor said that it is arguable whether criminalization of expression calculated to promote racial hatred is necessary. The first case, for our listeners' benefit, that actually found a person guilty under the Criminal Code of promoting hatred against identifiable groups for the use of the internet was a case called the Crown against Nicholson, which was decided finally in 2006. The computer that Mr. Nicholson was using revealed evidence of public statements, communications on web pages, emails, which promoted hatred and formed the basis for his ultimate charge. Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, which is now being revoked, I also highlighted, and the debate that came with it certainly highlighted the Canadian struggle around what is that dividing line. Section 13 talked about discriminatory practices, sending hate messages via telecommunications equipment, which was a provision added to that section made it clear that that included internet. You all perhaps have heard of Ernst Zundel, who, while living in Canada, constructed a website housed largely in the United States, and that website was eventually found by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to contain anti-Semitic Holocaust denial material. In fact, he moved a bit south of Canada to the United States before the decision could be fully enforced. Eventually, just to finish the story, he did make his way back into Canada, seeking actually refugee status, and was dealt with under our national security legislation, which found him to be a threat, sent him off to Germany, where he actually ended up serving 5 years in jail for Holocaust denial-related material. So now with Section 13 gone, the jurisdiction of the Human Rights, the Federal Human Rights Commission and Tribunal, it largely falls to the criminal jurisdiction to deal with online hate. There are two main sections, 318 and 319, which make it a crime to, are we still there? Sorry, it went blank for a minute. Section 318 and 319 deal with advocating either or promoting genocide or inciting hatred against an identifiable group. And these sections have been used, although very sparingly. We also have a couple of other provisions under the broadcasting provisions in the Immigration Act that have on occasion been raised, but again, limited use. There have been, and Mr. Zerndel was aware of it when they tried to send packages over the border. Border Control is able to stop any hate material, which, for example, could be ordered online. A recent dent is terrorism legislation, which does talk about terrorism-related offenses carried out online. Now, for the reality on the ground, well, just today you could open the news and you could see that the German Ministry of Justice noted that last year there was a 130% increase over 2000, I think it's comparing 2015 to 2014, but 130% increase on cases dealing online hate. Another survey showed that 1 in 3 internet users between the ages of 12 and 15 say that they experienced, interacted with hate speech online just in the past year. Again, we find that Canada is no exception. We have the range of people that use the internet to express messages of hate. Professor Barbara Perry, based here in Ontario, estimates that there's at least 100 neo-Nazi groups in Canada which all have, of some form, a web presence. In fact, the KKK has been in Canada since 1924 or earlier is the estimate, and they certainly have a web presence. From dedicated websites to music and videos to social networking and other forums to games and to those accidental contacts, we have it all in Canada. Whether the websites are housed here or individuals' jurisdiction shopping, we are not immune to it in Canada. How do we gauge all this? Well, again, to Barbara Perry, she sees it as, in a study that she conducted, as ever increasing in Canada. We can just look at some of the recent focus on cyberbullying to know that it's having an impact on our kids here in Canada. Our Stats Canada in 2009 General Social Survey estimates that 16% of respondents reported coming across hate on the internet. We know from our own surveys here at the CRRF that the vast majority of respondents do indicate that they have been or have witnessed hate on the internet. Now, police reported stats seem to indicate that that only about 1% of those incidents reported to police, although this does date back a couple of years, involve the use of computers or the internet. But they also estimate that this is a far small number than what's really happening out there, whether it's because people are reluctant to report, they don't know how to use the online reporting, or they're simply not quite sure of the criminal content, or perhaps in some reports they're worried about retaliation. Community surveys, such as the one done in the Jewish community as well as the Muslim community here in Canada, do estimate that over 30% of hate incidents are internet related. I'm sure we'll talk more as I turn it over to the other speakers, but we have examined here in Canada some of the solutions, if not as eagerly as we probably need to do given the growing reality. A federal study called the Canada Action Plan Against Racism back in 2005 which was a collaborative effort with a number of government departments, noted that in order to combat racism, we would have to deal with hate on the internet. And Prof. named Andrea Flame then went on to examine what could be done in terms of hate on the internet. And she, after interviewing a number of community-based individuals and other people dealing with this area, including myself, as it turns out, went on to identify a number of strategies to improve our ability here at home in Canada to address online hate, whether upping the number of opportunities, reporting sites for hate, increasing court-ordered bans or blocking of offensive materials, improvements to human rights commissions, complaints process, working with social media and other sectors of the community, and of course, increased funding out to community resource-based organizations. I think we have a lot more to grapple with as the last few weeks, few days here in Canada show a resurgence, a new boldness in the alt-right neo-Nazi movement, the anti-immigration voices. And so I really welcome the insight that each of you will bring to this topic as we look here at the CRRF at ways to craft a future that can really realize the promises of diversity, inclusion, and multiculturalism that Canadians report to us that is very much part of their identity. So thank you very much, and I turn it over to our moderator.
So thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Anita Bromberg. And we are going to now have our second speaker. So our second speaker will be Phil Gursky. So Phil Gursky is the president and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting. He worked as a senior strategic analyst at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service from 2001 to 2013. He's the author of The Threat from Within, Recognizing Al-Qaeda-Inspired Radicalization and Terrorism in the West, and the forthcoming Western Foreign Fighters, The Threat to Homeland and International Security. Phil Gursky, your turn.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and I want to thank the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for inviting me here today. I do want to apologize if my voice sounds a little bit raspy. I'm first of all getting over a cold, and secondly, I was at Grey Cup in Toronto last night watching Ottawa win in overtime, and I yelled myself hoarse. So I'm recovering from a weekend of partying in Toronto and celebrating Canadian football. So I will do my best to remain intelligible and to not lose my voice in the next 15 minutes or so. I wanted to pick up on some of the points that Anita just made. And as you read in my biography, my background is very much in intelligence. I worked in intelligence for more than 3 decades in Canada. And my focus while working for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service was looking at terrorism, and more specifically, terrorism in Canada, and even more specifically, looking at Canadians who are radicalizing to violence in accordance with something which is called Islamist extremism. It's called by many other names like Al-Qaeda inspired or Islamic State inspired extremism. So I want to look at hate crime from a purely terrorism perspective. And of course, our previous speaker did note that many other types of groups that do engage in what is known as terrorist activity under Section 83.01 of the Canadian Criminal Code do in fact have lots of hate with them, groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and other groups that are white supremacist in nature. We've had instances of what we call single-issue terrorism in Canada. That would be people that, for example, bomb abortion clinics, and we have, of course, environmental extremism as well. But I'm going to focus very narrowly on Islamist extremism for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it's something that I know best, having worked it every day for 15 years while working for CSIS. And secondly, it's what I've written on. And thirdly, and most importantly, it's pretty hard to argue that as we're nearing the end of 2016, that the threat from Islamist extremism, homegrown Islamist extremism, and internationally inspired Islamist extremism is by far the single greatest threat to national security. So for those reasons, I want to focus on that. But I do want to note that while I'm not a hate crime expert, it seems quite clear that hate crime is defined as singling out a particular group, whether that group be ethnic, religious, nationalist, sexual orientation, whatever, for some kind of hate. That's what terrorists do really well. They're really full of hate, and they're full of intolerance. And from an academic or from a study perspective, what's really interesting and very helpful in looking at these groups is that they're not shy about sharing their hatred. In fact, they're quite open about it. And most recently, the Islamic State, one of the more famous, shall we say, or infamous rather, terrorist groups right now, albeit somewhat on the downslide as events are unfolding in Iraq and Syria. Islamic State publishes a magazine called Dabiq. It's an online magazine. And in its most recent magazine, it very helpfully told us why it hates us. And it went through several categories of hate. And it hates, those of us who are atheist. It hates those of us who aren't Muslim. It hates those of us who are Christian or Jewish. It hates us because of our foreign policy. It hates us for what we're doing to Muslims. And so you find as you look at this particular group of individuals, whether they be here in Canada or in the West, or in fact anywhere around the world, is that Islamist extremists hate basically everything, and their hatred knows no bounds. In fact, statistics have shown quite clearly that the vast majority of victims of acts of terrorism around the world over the past 20 years, at least those people who suffered in attacks by Islamist extremist groups, are in fact other Muslims. And for a group that, or for a series of groups that claims it's protective of Islam and defending of Islam worldwide, it seems pretty hard to justify why the vast majority of people that have been killed by groups like this are in fact other Muslims. But it's easy to understand if you recall that as far as these groups are concerned, the victims are not Muslim. They're not real Muslims because they don't belong to the same groups. They don't abide by the same ideologies that Islamist extremist groups do. So in fact, their hatred is not only at what we would term the other, but their hatred extends to people within their own religious group, which I find really, really fascinating. So I think that they're pretty much an open book in terms of the types of things that they don't like. They're very good at propaganda. I referred quickly to the Dabiq online magazine that Islamic State puts out. There are other online magazines such as Inspire, which is put out by an Al-Qaeda group in Yemen, in southern Arabian Peninsula. They are huge at putting out propaganda on Twitter, on WhatsApp, on Facebook, any basic social media application you can find. You'll find that these groups will take advantage of that social media application to spread their hate and intolerance. And just to give you even a small sort of snapshot into how prevalent these groups are when it comes to spreading hatred, earlier on this year, under a fair bit of pressure by the U.S. government, the Twitter Corporation shut down accounts that had been found to be linked to Islamic State, i.e. people who were members of Islamic State or supporters of Islamic State. And at that point, Twitter had to shut down 125,000 Twitter accounts. And I find that number fascinating. 125,000 accounts that were linked to a group that is a listed terrorist entity, not just in Canada, but in the U.S., in the European Union, in fact, all over the world. And that's how many accounts that they were managing on a daily basis. They're putting out hundreds of thousands of tweets every day. Now, of course, those accounts should have been taken down because they are in fact supportive of terrorist activity. The sad part is that they are probably back up and functioning again within minutes under different aliases and different anonymous names. So I think we have to recognize that terrorist groups are really adept at getting their message out. They have certainly adapted to every kind of technology that's out there. In the old days, they used to use things like fax machines, and then we would fast forward to videos that were being copied and sent sort of by courier. Now, of course, they're as I said before, they're basically taking advantage of all possible media distribution. They're taking advantage of all types of technology that are out there, and we're having a really hard time keeping up with these guys. I find it really interesting, and I appreciate what Anita said in her earlier remarks about hate crimes in Canada and how we've had this problem for quite some time. I've also sort of had this opinion, and again, I qualify, I'm not an expert in hate crimes, either in Canada or elsewhere, but it's always been my impression that it's really hard to get successful prosecutions on hate crime for all the reasons that you mentioned before. There are issues of freedom of speech, there are charter issues. For our American friends, there are First Amendment issues which obviously interfere in even being able to prosecute what one person says is hate speech, another person says is freedom of speech. At the same time, it's also rather difficult to carry out prosecutions for terrorist offenses because the standard, the bar is pretty high in terms of satisfying the criminal code that, in fact, terrorist activity has taken place. We have had trials in Canada. In fact, the very first trial under the Anti-Terrorism Act, which was passed just after 9/11, and the first man who was arrested under the Anti-Terrorism Act in 2004, his judge tried to essentially challenge the law, saying that his client was engaged in freedom of religion activities, despite the fact that his client was trying to blow up things in downtown London in the United Kingdom. So I think that there's an interesting parallel here between trying to get successful prosecutions under hate crimes and similar prosecutions under the Terrorism Act. So I'm wondering here if, in fact, there's some kind of legal room to start thinking about terrorism as hate crime and vice versa. And maybe, in fact, by looking at the legislation that's out there and maybe trying to pool resources, or rather pool experiences and best practices that we've learned over the years in trying to identify and prosecute hate crime, as well as prosecute and identifying terrorism, I think you'll find that wherever you find terrorism, you'll certainly find hate. I'm not certain that wherever you find hate, you're going to find terrorism. Sort of the converse of that doesn't really apply in this case, but I do think that there are enough shared characteristics between those who abide and who engage in hate, as well as those that engage in terrorist activities, whether it's support for terrorism or whether it's actually participating in terrorist acts or planned terrorist acts or joining terrorist groups. So I'll just leave sort of on that point that from an academic perspective, I think from a CRRF perspective, I think from a public discussion perspective, we should maybe start asking the question of whether or not there is enough to be learned and to be applied from decades of research and decades of practice on the hate crime front and on the terrorism front to see if we can in fact combine what we've learned and what we haven't learned, where the gaps are, to be in a better position down the road to prosecute both hate crime and terrorism. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Galderski. So our next speaker will be Thomas Barish. So Thomas Barish is an expert in the field of sociology and criminology. Since the beginning of 2016, Mr. Barish has been working at the International Network Against Cyber Hate in Amsterdam, collecting data and conducting research on hate speech online. Furthermore, he is involved in the development of an international cyber hate database and complaint system. So, Mr. Thomas Barish.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to try, my best to introduce our major project in Europe that we've been working on since the beginning of January this year, funded by the European Commission. I hope you can see my slide. The project is called Research Report Remove Countering Cyber Hate Phenomena. And As you can see, we are working with several partners within 6 countries. We pulled together Jugendschutz from Germany, UNIA from Belgium, Zara from Austria, LICRA from France, MCI from Spain, and our 2 organizations in the Netherlands. And then, you know, the big organization that holds the whole thing together is the International Network Against Cyber Hate. The main goal of this project is to collect data on cyber hate instances from all monitored social media sites. And we've been collecting data from our partners on a monthly basis since May this year. And we've been merging this data, and we've been trying to draw up trends and write studies and reports about online hate on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, mainly these 3 big social media companies. But most of our partners monitor or receive complaints from on other platforms also. The final and biggest goal of the project is to develop an international online complaints form in 5 languages, which will be easy to use, and it will automatically disseminate complaints among partners, because most of our partners don't monitor online hate. They receive complaints from people who are browsing these pages, and they complain to us about these instances of cyber hate or online hate speech, because most of our partners and us have a much bigger chance to remove or get these cyber hate instances removed from these sites. We will also develop, hopefully completely by the middle of next year, an international online complaint system. So we will basically unify our partners in Europe, and they will enter all their monitoring and complaints that they received from users into a giant international complaint system. And this complaint system will feed into an also international online cyber hate database. So we are really hoping to actually create an international data mine for online hate speech on social media and websites. And this database will contain all the results of the complaints that we deal with, but also studies, research papers, reports, news articles, timelines of events with complaints attached to them, and a news feed with interesting information. And all these features will be very easily researchable by our data analysts. So hopefully we will have a very, very good idea about the trends in online hate speech on social media, at least within Europe. And we will also have a pretty good idea about how the social media companies are dealing with and handling these very major issues. I'm gonna introduce you to some of the findings of the project so far. So these are the numbers that we've collected between May and October this year. As you can see, we monitor different hate types separately. We have 6 main hate types that we focus on, but we also had to add a couple of new ones because some of the cases just didn't fit the 6 basic hate type that we started out with. As you can see, anti-Muslim hate, or if you want to call that Islamophobia, is the leading hate type based on the complaints and our monitoring. That is followed by racism, anti-refugee hate, and anti-Semitism. Anti-refugee hate is a very special one in a sense because it's fairly new. It's been on an upward trend since basically 2015. And what's special about it is that it's not really related to race, it's not related to ethnicity or language or nationality or religion. It's simply hate speech targeting people because they are immigrants, because they are refugees. So it's not surprising that it started out or it's been on an upward trend since last year when the refugee crisis started in Europe. These are our numbers on what percentage of complaints or cyber hate instances we have on different Web 2.0 platforms. So websites and forums and blogs are not included in this pie chart. These are only social media and video sharing sites and companies. And as you can see, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are the big, three basically. They have more than 90% of the complaints and monitoring that we do come from these three sites. And the final social media platform that has any kind of significance is Google Plus with its, very tiny 4.81%. All the other social media sites are basically dwarfed by these three big social media platforms. And these are the percentages if we include the Web 1.0 or the older, web formats. But even if we add the websites and blogs and forums, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook still rule the whole, cyber sphere, basically, and they still have more than 80% of the complaints or instances of cyber hate are still coming from them or on these platforms. And now we are moving into the territory of content removal, which is the pivotal question of our work. And our main goal is basically getting hate speech removed from social media sites as fast as we can. I'm saying as fast as we can because if social media companies don't remove these content fairly swiftly, it gets shared and reshared and reshared, so it has a snowball effect. So even if just a fake news or a racist meme or video or any type of other hate speech content stays online for several days, its removal basically becomes meaningless after a while, because if it had already been seen by hundreds of thousands or millions of people and then it gets removed, then its purpose have already been fulfilled. As you can see, most, or at least Facebook and YouTube, are fairly okay when it comes to case removal. You don't see it, but I see the exact numbers. So as far as we can see right now, Facebook has removed more than 76% of complaints or instances of online hate when we reported them to them. YouTube removed almost 80%, 79.35%, and Twitter is basically the worst, although they have been becoming more and more vigilant when it comes to cyber hate lately, because they faced very serious criticisms, especially from governments in Europe, and obviously with the emergence of the alt-right in the US. But their removal rate is still below 70%, so around 70 or around 67% right now. I'm gonna discuss these issues a bit further with you, because even though these numbers seem quite high, these removal rates, we still face very, very frustrating issues and problems with social media companies when it comes to removal. You can see a couple of instances and examples of cyber hate on my slides, but I am obviously not going to read out loud because, you know, nobody should probably. And you can see removal rates or removal times. Now, these are interesting because the social media companies signed a code of conduct with the European Union and the German government that they respond or remove cyber hate when it's reported to them within 24 hours. So we've been working together with the European Commission to monitor, you know, their output, Facebook's, Twitter's, YouTube's response times, and the picture is not nice at all. Most of the time, they don't stick to the 24-hour promise that they had given to the governments and the EU. And as you can see, many times they only remove things even after a month. These are the previous ones were examples from the Netherlands. These are examples from Germany. And as you can see, in Germany, the situation is a little bit better than in the Netherlands, but still several very serious cases of online hate speech weren't removed within 24 hours, or even were only removed after a week or even more, even longer times. And then we come to, you know, even more serious problems when very similar cases of online hate simply don't get removed, or one of those, you know, will be removed without extra explanation, and some of them simply won't be removed at all for some reason. And usually social media companies are not very good in explaining to us and to their users why they remove something or why they leave something online, besides, you know, a letter that they send out automatically that the content didn't violate their user guidelines. These are also some numbers from France collected by LICRA, our partner there, and where you see the non-applicable part of the pie charts, those are the cases or the complaints made by LICRA to social media companies that weren't removed at all. So this is a pretty high number. And as you can see, the less than 24 hours part of the chart is quite tiny, both in July and in September. So social media companies don't really live up to their promises that they made to the European government. There are also other issues that we face. For instance, Holocaust denial in the Netherlands is illegal, and usually social media companies, well, historically, have been quite good in removing serious, you know, national law violations from their sites. But for some reason, lately, for instance, Facebook started not removing some instances of Holocaust denial for some reason. And they stated to us that from now on, they will only remove such things for the request for only the request of state authorities, because even though they are illegal in the country where we are viewing them from, it's not in violation with their terms. And also we face other problems, like if you read into these examples that I put in there, that were not removed and that were removed, you can see that these are basically pretty much all the same type of online hate speech patterns. And yet, you know, these three on the top were not removed, and the bottom two were removed. And there's no explanation why. So inconsistency is a very, very major problem. Now, for some reason, I don't see everything on this slide that I put up in there, but the main things can be seen. And this is the inconsistencies that we have internationally when it comes to removal rates. And as you can see in Germany, removal rates on Facebook, YouTube are extremely high, especially when they are reported by Jugendschutz, our partner. But if we go to France, these numbers drop to very, very low percentages. And in Austria, the situation is even worse. So there's this international discrepancy where they will remove several things in one country on a regular basis, and they won't remove it on another in another country, even though the user guidelines and rules of engagement are the same in every country. Now, as a conclusion, I would like to highlight to you the fact that these numbers were provided by NGOs and civil society organizations who work with these social media companies on a regular basis. So they know people in their complaint offices, they know people high up in the hierarchy of these companies, and yet we face frustration and rejection all the time. So single users have an even harder time, and the numbers from Germany that the German government have collected show that the removal rates of social media companies when it comes to reports by single users are abysmal, and they haven't turned towards a positive trend in the past couple of months either. So we really have to keep a pressure on these companies, at least to adhere to the laws, of the countries that they are, working in, and also to take into consideration, how huge of an effect they have on society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas Veric. Our next speaker and last speaker for before we shift to the Q&A session will be Dr. Andre Oboler. So Andre Oboler is the CEO of the Online Hate Prevention Institute, co-chair of the Working Group on Anti-Semitism in the Media and the Internet of the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism, a distinguished visitor for the IEEE Computer Society, and an expert member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So Dr. Andre Oboler.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for having me. I had a set of slides. We on the presentation? I don't think I can do that. There we go.
Yes,
thank you very much. Okay, great. I just want to preface what I'm going to say by saying that this is a very big topic, and I've cut what I want to say down to 15 minutes, but I've included in the slide deck a lot of additional information. So we can share this with participants, and I hope people will have time to look. I may a little bit beyond what I intend if there's interest. Okay, let's move forward. So the first question I wanted to address is, why are we concerned about monitoring in the first place? And it's not such a simple question, because for decades there's been work done on the online hate area which actually measuring the hate. Bold reports which were showing, can you hear me? Sorry, yeah, you can hear me? I'm just, okay, good.
It's just cutting a little bit, but we can hear you.
Okay, good. If it cuts out, let me know. For a long time, the reports were using examples.
I think it's cutting out.
Indication. Okay. We good?
I think we're good. I'm just going to check, but you can continue.
Okay. So for a long time, we were just looking at examples. And the problem is that with just having examples with no numbers, we can't judge the scale of, can't monitor whether the situation is getting better or worse. We can't evaluate whether the programs that are being used to try and reduce the level of online hate are actually having a real impact. And we can't judge whether the self-regulation, which is the efforts made by the companies, are actually effective or not. So the companies will say, yes, we're doing something, but unless we have numbers, we can't tell whether that's sufficient. We also can't tell what the blind spots are if we don't have numbers. So in order to move forwards, we need to have numbers on the problem. We need to monitor it over time, and eventually we need to move to a standards and compliance system, which is really what the previous presentation was getting towards, saying there is a 24-hour response time. How much of the time are we actually within that? The platform's failing to within the time limit. So there's three basic approaches to measuring and monitoring online hate. The first approach is to use experts. So this is where a group of experts within civil society or within academia go out and find the hate themselves. And the advantage of this is every item that's selected by an expert with expert judgment, and we get high quality data. When you have a small pool of data to look at, this is very effective. So if you're monitoring the hate pages of known hate groups, or if you're monitoring a website like Stormfront, this is perfect and works very well, because finding the hate is not difficult. The hard part and the time-consuming part is making judgments. The disadvantages is that this approach is very expensive on an item-by-item basis. It takes a lot of time, and experts are expensive compared to other approaches. Getting a large sample becomes prohibitively expensive, so we end up dealing with much smaller samples, which means we don't really know if the data that's being gathered is representative of the wider trend or not. Through this approach is what are the worst cases of BC. The second approach is automation, and this today is largely done using text analysis. So this is where we have a computer program that automatically reads all of the tweets or all of the Facebook posts, and I mean all of them that are going up, and then tries to extract the interesting content. That's usually looking for keywords. So the advantage of this is that we're dealing with very large volumes. It's able to be done quickly, and it's able to be done cheaply. Where we're looking for something like a racial slur, it's easy to find because that word or combination of words is only ever used in a negative context. So we get very good positive results in identifying that. Another advantage is that we can do it repeatedly, so we can do it month by month on a large sample of data. And these sorts of tools also tend to automatically archive the hate speech, so we can build up an archive very easily with no real human intervention. The disadvantage is that firstly you need technical expertise and software to do this sort of approach, but more importantly, you will get a lot of false positives, because you account of context, so, or not very well. So somebody that is using an example of hate speech, like the presentations we've already seen today, those presentations would be labeled as hate speech because they contain examples of hate speech. It's in a context where there should be an exception, but the automated approach is not able to tell that. There's also a problem where certain racial slurs may be considered acceptable and not hate speech by the community that the slur normally is referring to. And again, you know the obvious examples. Another problem with the automated approach is that there are blind spots. So finding racial slurs is easy, but what about the case of coded language, where the words that you're searching for are not actually being used in the hate speech? Those examples will not be found. There's also a problem that messages that are contained in images or video are picked up by the automatic approach unless the accompanying text actually uses the relevant words. There's also a problem where, as a result of these blind spots, there can be a disproportionate focus on racial slurs rather than on other more serious forms of hate speech. So, for example, the focus of NGOs and governments can effectively end up focusing on people being called names rather than on incitement to actually commit violence just because the data is easier to get. So that's something we need to be very careful about as people working in the field. There's also a problem that because the process is automated, people can try and subvert the process. The last approach is crowdsourcing. This is where the reports are made by the public, either through a website or an app, and then they can be evaluated by experts or automatically dealt with by the public. And therefore the advantage is that when we go to experts, we at least have human judgment, which is much better than software by itself and much cheaper than experts having to make every determination. The disadvantage is, again, there's a technical need for a reporting platform, but you also need to get the public using the platform. If people don't use it, you don't get any data. The quality of the data is also going to vary. Different members of the public will have different levels of competence, types of hate speech, and the system needs to take account of that. A simple system can also end up having lots of duplicates. And this is a problem because it creates a greater pool of work for experts and can create double counting when we start looking at the statistics. So the software needs to actually deal with that when it's taking public reports. And the final issue is that these sorts of systems may not automatically archive everything, so that needs to be built into the system. I'm just about out of time, but what I wanted to then talk about very briefly are two systems which we're running. The three different approaches are each useful in their own way, but we believe that the crowdsourcing approach is the best approach going forwards as a general approach, although the two other approaches do have utility in specific areas. Crowdsourcing's main advantage is that it can get to very high levels of data and not have the blind spots of the automated approaches. So fightagainst-hate.com is our primary tool. It's a reporting platform. People log in with their Facebook account. They paste in the web address from Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, and they classify what sort of hate they're reporting. The system only allows a person to report a single item of hate once, and if multiple people are reporting the same item, so we have a record of items of hate, even if they're coming from, and we know how many people have been affected by that item. The system also has a lot of focus on quality control, and it processes the data from what people give us and then extracts additional information from the social media company as well as what users supply us, and we're able to store all of that. It lets users view what they have reported, and it also for a random item that's been reported by others and then to evaluate it themselves, which helps us improve quality. It's been endorsed by the Global Forum to Combat Anti-Semitism, and it's recently been praised in two UNESCO reports. That software was used to gather the data for a major report on anti-Semitism. This was released earlier this year by the Global Forum to Combat Anti-Semitism. The report looks at 4 types of anti-Semitism and gives 3 examples from out of that pool of 2. We measure how they're responding over a number of months, and after 9 months, we gave YouTube and Twitter the data and asked them to reevaluate it. And we can see, you know, very little difference was actually made once they even had the pool of data we were monitoring. It didn't really change their judgments very much. And then we measured the takedown rates over time. That report's available if people want to have a look at it. We've also got a report which is looking at anti-Muslim hate, which uses the same methodology and the same tool, and that one has a sample of 1,000 items. In both cases, we gathered the data over a period of 2 months. In 2017, this system is being adapted. It's going to allow automatic archiving of screenshots of the content. That's already well underway. We're also creating widgets so that third-party sites, for example, different NGOs, to report content directly into the system, and that widget can also exist on Facebook pages. The widgets can be customized so that organizations can actually get access to the statistics and data that's coming through their gateway to the system. We also have a new piece of software called CSI Chat, and this software allows access to that data that's been reported. And it allows experts to then create a file of hate and subcategories, etc. They can take the incoming hate reported by the public, file it under these different folders. They can then filter it by date, filter it by the incoming classification, filter it by the country where it was reported, etc., and work with that data. The same item can simultaneously be in many different folders because we recognize that one item of hate speech may actually involve many different types of hate. We also include and data from the person who reported it to us in the data that the experts now have access to. We allow experts to create what we call a case file, where they can add notes and then attach many different social media items to the one file. So, for example, you can have a record on an extremist group, and you can attach everything social media based, all of their YouTube videos, all of the users that are members, etc., into the one case file and track it all together. We also have a sophisticated which looks at, for example, hate over time, or compares how much has been classified under one type of hate compared to another. That tool was finished this month, or finished as a prototype. It's up and running, and there'll be a little bit more work on that, but that will soon be available for people to use. We're also in discussions with groups in Canada now about potentially doing a national project in order to gather data on either one or more types of online hate speech. It's very early in the process. What we do know is that project will hopefully run in both English and French, and it will use the tools which I've just outlined. I'll stop there for time, but there are, I'll just flick through, there are, for example, screenshots of our software. This is the first reporting system, and it shows you how it's done. And the report, sort of trends and graphs which we were able to generate, takedown rates which we've collected. This is based on a sample of 2,000. And then the new software for categorizing and for experts to work with the data. So I'll let people look at this at their own time in more detail, and I'll be happy to answer any questions when we get to the question session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrea Bowler. So we thank you to all our speakers, and we're now going to take questions from all participants to this webinar. You can use the little box, the Q&A, that you will find at the bottom of your screen. So you can write the question, and I will read the question for the benefit of everyone. Please remain constructive in your questions, and of course remain civil. Remember, you have like world specialists of online hate here gathered, so it's not the moment to write any kind of stuff. So please go ahead don't hesitate to ask your question, and I'm going to check if there's a question already. Okay, so it's a question that have already been answered by Thomas Barris, but I want to ask it again because I think it's interesting, but I cannot find it anymore. Oh wait, there's a new question. So I'm going to answer a new question. So first question is like, who is Dr. Oboler working with in Canada? So this is for Dr. Oboler.
Okay, thank you for the question. The project going forward, I don't want to say who we're working with just yet, but we're open to working with a range of groups, and we're talking to the foundation as well. I mean, anybody that's interested in being involved in such a project, I would encourage to approach me, and we'll be happy to discuss in more detail. There is a major organisation looking at spearheading it, but I don't want to name them until they've actually, signed and agreed that they're in.
Thank you very much. So another question. Is there a way to find out the community standards for social media sites? Where might they be listed? So who wants to answer to this question? Somebody wants to answer this question? Yeah, okay, Thomas. Thomas?
Yes. They are, all social media sites have their community standards and guidelines on their pages. So for instance, on YouTube or on Facebook, if you go to your profile page and go a bit down, you will find, privacy settings and policies and everything else on the bottom left-hand side. Sadly, I don't know where Twitter have these because I'm not a huge Twitter user, but the point is that, yeah, you can find their guidelines. They are posted, they are public everywhere.
Thank you very much. So I'll take another question. My question, hello, my question is regarding the statistic presented by Mr. Barrett with regard to hate. I was rather surprised by the statistic on anti-Tsiganism, 2.7%. I was wondering what factors serve to explain the number. So I guess this question is again for Mr. Barrett.
Yes. Well, the number is low, and I guess the question was, directed to that fact. That's because most of our partners are not specifically focused on the Roma community and hate against the Roma community. So we recognize this as a major problem in Europe, but we mostly have partners right now in the project that are from Western Europe, where hate against Roma people is prevalent, but it's less in your face as in Eastern Europe. And also simply is just we receive less complaints about anti-Roma hate than all the others. So this low number doesn't mean that there's no hate out there against Roma people on social media sites. It just means that it's only a very tiny portion that gets to us, basically.
Thank you very much. So I'll take another question. You just have to go between the questions. So new question, is there any kind of override for Facebook who we can go to? Okay, is there any kind of override for YouTube or Facebook who we can go to with concerns after being rejected, I guess, because hate and violence are not against community standards. So yeah, I guess it means like, is there a way to appeal the decision from Facebook? Who wants to answer that? One of you wants to answer that? Okay, and then both of you can like,
Okay.
We'll begin by Dr. Bowler and then Thomas.
I think we're going to have the same answer, which is that the companies don't want to put in the human resources to deal with the public, you know, with a human response all the time, but they talk as that work with them. So that includes the members of INUP, it includes my own organisation, etc. We have the connections. So I would recommend reporting it to the NGO community, to the people that are working on the issue. But even then, you know, we get thousands of reports all the time. And it's only the most serious ones that we can actually follow them up on, because if we bombard them at senior levels of management every time there's a complaint, they'll very quickly stop talking to channels when there's, for example, a threat of violence or something that is very, very serious or going viral, etc. It does work, but it needs to be used cautiously, and it's not available to the public at large.
Thank you. Thomas Barrett, do you want to add something to that?
Yes. I guess, you know, it's interesting because there's no real appeal system for rejected complaints. There is an appeal system if your page or profile has been removed, and then you can appeal that decision. But when it comes to complaints, yeah, I would say the same thing. Either report it to some kind of organization or NGO that work within your country, because they have a lot or a much higher chance to get something removed. Or you can keep, you know, reporting the same content. And as I answered a couple of people already in writing, and I told them that the more people complain about one instance of cyber hate or hate speech or violence online, the more likely the social media platform will remove it. So if you can, you know, get people to complain about the same problem, then, you know, there's a much higher chance that they will remove it.
Thank you very much. So I'll take another question. Another question. Sorry, there's just tons of new questions that just appeared. Okay, I'm going to ask this one. What can or should be done on a local level? What are the advantages, disadvantages to working with national or international anti-hate organizations? Who wants to take this question? Oh, and Dr. Andrew Bowler, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I just replied in writing there. One of the problems we've got, if you have 1,000 people who each report something to the company themselves, each person knows about one item, and nobody knows that there are 1,000 problems. If it's reported to a national or an international body, then suddenly we get a bigger picture, and we know that there are 1,000 items, and maybe 1,000 people have reported those 1,000 items, and that is a very different situation. So that's the advantage of actually working with civil society and not directly by reporting it to the companies.
Thank you very much. So let's take another question. Is there anything the CRRF doing to address the gap created by the revoking Section 30 CHRA? If you want to take it, take it. Okay.
Well, thank you. That was actually an issue that came up at our national conference. I actually have my own opinions about it, and I think you might have understood from my remarks that I think that there needs to be a role for our human rights commissions, given that they're both federally and provincially active There are proposals to relook at the issue. For example, Erwin Kotler, who is one of our leading past members of Parliament, had, and a former member of the party that's now the majority party, had a proposal to bring it back. When it was first taken away, it was felt that there wasn't enough understanding to properly implement it, and because of penalty provisions, it touched on the area of criminal law. There have been briefs on the solution that laid at that time was to simply remove the penalty clauses and focus on what the human rights commissions, tribunals do well, and that's find a compromise solution that is not punitive. So we as an organization have not taken a specific position on whether or not Section 13 should come back, but we certainly are in favor of finding solutions for this growing problem, knowing that the solution doesn't lie solely in the criminal legislation, that there needs to be a multiple platforms, as we've seen from our speakers, suggested in both holding corporations and social media to account, as well as enlisting the leadership of our government bodies. Our position basically is that we should take an overall look at the reality, the growing reality of online hate and the resurgence, if you will, or to the main media of racist behavior, and craft a solution that fits our time.
All right, thank you very much. So I'll take another question. These are answers. I'm not going to read the answers. Okay, so if there's no more new questions, I'm going to see if there's like older one that has not been answered to. Okay. All right, this one. Okay, so another question. So how significant is Holocaust denial today? What are the major platforms? So who wants to take this this question? Thomas, all right? Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. You can answer the question.
Yeah. To be honest, since we handle Holocaust denial as anti-Semitism, therefore, the numbers on Holocaust denial kind of melt into the anti-Semitism category. So I can't tell you exactly how prevalent it is, but it is prevalent. That much I can say. And as far as platform goes, as I showed you, definitely Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. These are the three major platforms. It doesn't really matter what kind of hate or what hate type we are talking about. These three major social media sites are the ones where we find most of the hate speech and where we receive most of our complaints from.
Thank you very much. So I'll take your. Oh, sorry. Okay, Andre, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just add the work actually breaks it down into four categories, one of which is Holocaust. In my slides, it shows that Holocaust denial made up 12% of our sample of over 2,000 items. We also have a breakdown of the hate by platform. Holocaust denial off memory, I can find the report and look it up, but off memory, Holocaust denial was much more prevalent on YouTube than it was on I think YouTube was almost 50% of all the Holocaust denial, we found that the type of anti-Semitism actually varied, well, the relative percentage varied by platform and by hate type.
Thank you very much. So next question, yeah, we still have time, so let's continue. Next question. So a person asks, say something deemed hateful in country A, and it spreads to country B, but each country has different laws, so it's problematic to deal with. So it's realistic to try and argue that terrorism could be better dealt with under hate laws. So I guess Bill can respond to this question because you started to respond it in writing. So it's good for the benefit of everyone if you can answer to this question. Is it? Yeah.
Specifically, is that each country really has its own definition of terrorism, and there's so many different definitions out there at international organizations and within national criminal codes that I think, as the question points out, terrorism is not terrorism. It really depends on the jurisdiction in question. So I'm not advocating that we look at terrorism law necessarily as a way to deal with hate speech and hate crime, but I do think there really is enough in common there. And again, the beauty of beauty in a perverse sense about hate speech and hate crime is it tends to be overt. It tends to be in your face. It's palpable. It's very transparent about what people think about certain groups. So I guess I'm just saying that, terrorism investigations often are very difficult to carry out for all kinds of reasons. Terrorists tend to be a little more circumspect, a little more quiet with what they're trying to do. So I think we need to combine what we know about hate and know about terrorism, and so that both fields can in fact inform each other.
Thank you very much. Another question. We still have time to take 2 or 3. It's a question for you, Phil, again. Is there data on online hate proliferation which somehow captures which regions of Canada this is coming from most?
Well, again, I can't speak to hate speech because it's not my specialty, but certainly if you look at, terrorism in Canada since 9/11 over the past 15 or 16 years or so, it's been right across the country. We've had cases in almost all provinces of Canada, so it's not particularly limited to one province or one city. I mean, obviously you tend to see it in larger population centers, but we've seen cases in very small towns, in out-of-the-way places in Canada, which goes to show that terrorism is not just a big city phenomenon. And with all this social media that my fellow speakers today have been talking about, it's being spread all the time, everywhere by everyone. So terrorism doesn't have to occur in a place where there's lots of people. It can actually occur in a very small town where all of your buddies and all the people that think the same way that you do are connected by social media, the internet. They're not actually your neighbors anymore.
Thank you very much. We'll take a last question. I think this one is good because I think all of you can answer, and it can be good if it gives you the occasion to have a final word for this webinar. So the question is, don't you think the teachers in schools should take proactive approach to develop an action to build a sense of fellow feelings amongst all students in regard to racial discrimination? So if you can respond to this question, or maybe take this opportunity to give a word of conclusion. Who wants to begin?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
So absolutely, and we've been trying for years now to get this notion of terrorism and what we call violent radicalization on the school agenda. It's hard. The school agendas are very, very packed with information. Teachers are often a little bit nervous about talking about these types of issues, but I couldn't agree more that we have to get more involved, because we know that if children are raised in environments where hate and discrimination are seen as, are not welcome, they don't turn into hateful adults. So the earlier the better, absolutely.
Thank you very much. So Thomas or Andre, who wants to follow up? If you have nothing to answer this question, maybe it's a good moment to make a little conclusion. Maybe Andre.
Okay, I'll go next. definitely the answer is yes. We need to engage with schools and educate students, but the problem we've got is this will have an impact decades from now. The massive increase in online hate means we can't actually wait that long, and we can't wait for people who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s and older to just die off because they missed the boat. So yes, we need to do things in schools, work with young people, but we also need to educate and work with the wider community as well, and have education about online hate being a part of ongoing life education. As a final comment, I'll just repeat again that the project with Canada going forward, we're very interested in talking to any organisations that are potentially interested in being involved. If you're from an organisation, by all means, contact me. An organisation that would be interested, please pass that message on. Okay. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And maybe Thomas there, so a word on that?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for your time. We really appreciate it, and for the really amazing insights that that you have brought. I really think there'll be a follow-up, and there'll be maybe action plan that can be done through after this webinar, because obviously there's a lot of things that can be done in between Europe and Canada and Australia. It's really interesting. So thank you very much. Thank you to all participants. There was a lot of you, and you stayed engaged until the end of this webinar. Thank you very much. Our next webinar will be a webinar in French. Its title will be Laïcité et pluralisme culturel, un dialogue de sourds. It will take place on December 13th between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. and it will feature Rachida Azdouz, Pierre Bosset, and Arun Bouassi. All the information will be soon available on our website. So thank you very much, and have a great end of day for some of you, and beginning of day for the other, and middle of day for the rest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.